Aloha, spooky nerds, and welcome to Talking Strange, paranormal pop culture show with the Den of Geek Network. As always, I am your host, Aaron Sagers, a journalist, an author, a researcher of all things weird. Currently, I can also be seen on Travel Channel and Discovery Plus's Paranormal Caught on Camera. And today we're talking about witchcraft and Hollywood, as well as some timely topics such as the Satanic Panic and how that's connected to witchcraft and Hollywood. And, you know, the witch is, as a cultural archetype, has existed in some form since the beginning of recorded history, and her nature has changed through technological developments and socio-cultural shifts. That is very much a statement that comes from the book Lights, Camera, Witchcraft, A Critical History of Witches in American Film and Television. In Lights, Camera, and Witchcraft, we trace the figure of the witch through American cinematic history from 1896 to 2020 with an analysis of the entertainment industry's shifting boundaries concerning expressions of femininity, focusing on films and television series from Bewitched to The Craft. And this book, in fact, right here, this book also reflects on the changing gender roles, religion, the modern practice of witchcraft, and female agency. And it is written by our guest, Heather Greene. She's a freelance writer, a religion journalist, and editor, received a BA at Wesleyan University in film and an MA in film studies from Emory University, studied film, theater at Cornell University and the University of Paris, and has been studying witchcraft and the occult for more than 30 years and has written for Turner Classic Movies, The Wild Hunt, Circle Magazine, Pathos.com, other outlets, and her work can currently be seen at Religion News Service and Religion Unplugged. And she is also a member of the Circle Sanctuary, the Covenant of the Goddess, and the Religion News Writers Association. So, Heather, welcome to Talking Strange. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I can't wait to talk witches today.
I know. I'm excited. First off, really great book. You definitely get more than your money's worth of content. This is a big old book of research. Before I get into the nuts and bolts of it, as a journalist myself and a researcher, how long did it take you to put all of this together?
Well, I could say the long story would probably be about 25 years, but that's a whole nother story. From the idea of doing it to actually doing it, there was a lot of years between. But the actual saying, okay, now it's time, beginning the research for this particular incarnation through, I would say, maybe about 5 years.
Okay. A lot of TV and movie watching.
A lot of TV. That was the fun part. TV, movie watching, and then some trips to the archives, and lots of reading of academic sources, as well as, reader responses to movies, and just a lot of research was involved. And a lot of it, most of it was fun in the end.
Well, I guess the why question comes up. Why this topic? Why is this something that you decided to sink your teeth into, think about for 20 years, and then really intently focus on for at least 5 years?
And that's a great question. And it really gets to the trends in witchcraft and witch films that we've seen. And so the idea came about in the late 90s. And that was after The Craft, when Charmed and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Sabrina were all on television. I noticed a trend that there was this popularity of witchcraft shows in the media, either on a small scale or a larger scale. And so I said, there's something to this. Why is this happening right now? So that's when I was still in grad school, and I was like, this is what I want to do the work. But then I had to put it on pause. Life happens, as we say. And then I noticed I was doing journalism. I'd gotten back into writing regularly and was more involved with the media and the pagan community and the modern witchcraft community, and I saw it happening again. I started to see the trends in around 2013, 2014. Think Beautiful Creatures and American Horror Story Coven and Salem. All these shows were coming out, and we saw this happening again, just like the 90s. I said, whoa, 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 wait, what's going on here? This is happening again. Now I'm going to do what I was going to do in the 90s. I'm going to do it now. And that's what started it.
It seems like based on what you write about early in the book, it maybe the seeds were planted early on when you were a little girl watching Wizard of Oz.
Oh, absolutely. And my interest in the occult and witchcraft and the supernatural and anything like that was definitely planted early on. I loved The Wizard of Oz. It was I say it's my favorite movie now. I loved it as a child. I loved Sabrina the cartoon, the concept of a lot of the things that witchcraft stands for, and not just witchcraft, but other aspects of the occult. I started studying tarot in the early 90s in college. And so the seeds were definitely planted, as they were for film in general, because I was fascinated with golden era Hollywood films right from the beginning. So it was sort of a merger of my two interests, the performance art, movies specifically, and as well as my interest in the occult and witchcraft.
You talk about through at least the 60s, it seems like Margaret Hamilton, who was the Wicked Witch from Wizard of Oz, that she tended to pop up periodically, sometimes as herself, and then donning the character of the Wicked Witch through various things, including in Mr. Rogers and on Sesame Street and on other shows. The Paul Lynde show, I believe, is one that she shows up in. But how did she change the game? Obviously not just for you, but how did she change the game for the character of the witch? Because you talk about how witches were present very, very early on in American film.
Well, Margaret Hamilton herself, I don't think it was her aim to change anything. I don't even think it was the producers of that film's idea that they were changing anything. The one thing that they did change was our concept of the witch having green skin. That came specifically from The Wizard of Oz. But in terms of our ideas about witchcraft and witches, I think the interesting thing to note, I don't think it changed anything, but the interesting thing to note is that there were two witches in that film, Glinda and the Wicked Witch of the West. And yet it seems that the Wicked Witch of the West and Margaret Hamilton have been the one that's been featured more. She's had more significance, more prominence in our culture and our fascination than Glinda. And I adore Glinda too, but it seems that Margaret Hamilton's character has sustained a power that the other one hasn't, which is interesting because the Wicked Witch is evil.
Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, again, as you kind of talk about later on, the green skin is presented as a way of making her seem monstrous, but later it's a way of depicting otherness and racial discrimination, such as in the movie or the play Wicked. Alphaba, is that her character's name?
Yeah,
Alphaba, yeah.
Exactly, and that points to the change. She got a backstory first in the novels, and then Broadway, and I believe they are trying to put that on, bring it to the silver screen as well. That she turns out to be correct. She turns out to be, the witch turns out to be the good guy. We didn't know the backstory behind, and we see a lot of that going on with movies today, with evil characters giving us backstories that show us, oh, we might not agree with what they did, but we understand why they did it. So there's been a flip recently.
The book is focusing on American television and film. Obviously, there's so many different depictions of witches and witchcraft across the globe, and there's so much material that you could cover. I understand why you had to narrow it down, and it's still a big book. The depiction, the sort of the kind of categories, the buckets that you tend to fall within are the types of witches: the accused woman, the wild woman, and the fantasy witch. Can you kind of talk a little bit about those three categories, and was that just extrapolated by looking large at these genre and or the characters and saying, oh, okay, this is where it always fits? Or talk about the evolution of those categories and the definition of each.
Sure. Well, you know, when I went into this, I said I'm going to let Hollywood lead. I'm not going to assume or make structures on the book until I find out what's out there, because I had no idea other than my limited viewing at that point. So over time, there was a light bulb went off and I said, wait a minute, there's three main categories. And this helped me present it. This helps me present it to the reader to demonstrate the flow and the changes. And so it really worked out pretty nicely. In the early days, it's very clear, the categories. And that makes sense to a Hollywood that was limited and also censored. More recently, there's a lot of crossover between them, and you can see bits and pieces and transitions from one to the other. And I talk about that at the end of the book, last few chapters. So who are they? So the accused woman is the easiest. This is the Salem story. This is the woman who is not magical. She doesn't have any magical powers of any kind, but what she does is misstep and is, for one reason or another, according to society, and becomes an accused witch. It's the classic Salem story, Joan of Arc, etc. So those are the most limited, but it's the clearest to see. Although sometimes the accused woman could wind up coming back as a wild woman, which is the next category, especially in the ghost and paranormal films of the 90s. So the wild woman is a witch whose magic has to be explained. And that's how I define her. She doesn't have magic just because. She has magic because she either has studied satanic ritual, she has magic because she's been given a power by some deity, typically a God-given power. Think of like, well, Carrie is not really, Carrie is an example, but her power didn't come from God. We don't know where her power came from. But there are examples of that. Her power has to be explained. She's an herbalist. She is some other type of defined magical practitioner. She's wild. And that practice makes her wild. The last category is fantasy. So fantasy witches, they're magical, definitely, but their magic doesn't need to be explained, typically because they're in the fantasy genre, and magic just is. So the film just defines her as such. So, but it's not necessarily in the fantasy genre. So Samantha is a fantasy witch. She's not in a fantasy genre, but her magic doesn't need to be explained. It just is, and we accept it. So that's the fantasy witch. Those are the three main categories, and there are a lot of subcategories in that.
Yeah, and you do, yeah, towards the end of the book, you do talk about sort of the crossover. We're looking at characters like Maleficent that starts out in one form as more of an accused, and then becomes more of the, I believe, fantasy witch at the, through her story. So kind of, yeah, we're getting a little bit of everything now. But in the early filmmaking of American film, I think there's this tendency to believe that perhaps we were always viewing the witch in those early days as evil, or perhaps worthy of that person. Maybe not worthy of the persecution, but evil others. That maybe was not the case in early cinema, right? There were examples of the innocent and even maybe a sympathetic gaze given to the witches.
Absolutely. The most number of Salem-style stories, and I use Salem because that's the American witch trial standard, as far as a narrative standard. These films didn't tell the Salem story necessarily, but the most amount were done in the silent era, during a time when Hollywood loved to tell sort of historical films or based on history. People were eating these up. So we saw a ton of this happening in the silent era. So you had a lot of accused women then. And you also didn't have the dynamic evil that we saw later on. What you have mostly are witches who were, if they were bad, they were just mischievous. They were secondary characters. Often the bad ones or the evil ones were secondary characters serving the true opponent, the true evil figure. So there weren't that many really truly evil witches until you start to see in the 30s and 40s some pop up. And it really isn't until the 70s and 80s and 90s that you see the extremes happening in that respect. Yeah.
And I'm going to get to that in a moment. I want to talk another minute about some other big movements before we get into the 70s and 80s. Let's talk about Bewitched for a moment, because, you know, you talk about, you write in the book that the witch archetype exists in the two modes, one of oppression and one of empowerment. And then you discuss sort of feminism and the role of women in society and how it kind of aligns with the depiction of witches. Talk more about Bewitched and where Bewitched fits within that, because it seems, I mean, I loved Bewitched. I grew up on reruns of Bewitched and definitely had a crush on Elizabeth Montgomery, but I just loved the show. But as you examine in your book, there's sort of two different approaches at looking at Bewitched, depending on where your opinions are about gender roles and the role of the witch. So talk a little bit about the importance of Bewitched and where you kind of came to settle on that particular piece of TV.
Well, you know, it's iconic and lasted for I think 9 years, and a lot of what it was doing was during that period of time, starting I believe in 1964, and walking the line between what Hollywood and TV had been doing and trying to transition or comment on what was coming, because Hollywood was struggling at the time, trying to find the voice. So Bewitched sort of walks that line, and it walks the line in terms of women's empowerment. Specifically, amongst other things, because it's showing Samantha, this witch, who is trying to give up her witchdom. I think that's what the producer said. She doesn't want to be a witch necessarily. So she's trying to give up her power. She's trying to say, I don't want to do this, but she can't. And that's the message that it's sending to women at the time, that if that you are who you are, you can't give that up. Why bother? And so she's constantly trying. And in the end, almost every show, she and her magic save the day. But yet every time she's constantly trying, she's trying to be June Cleaver. She's trying to be the 1950s perfect housewife, but she fails every time. And the key aspect of this to understand is that witchcraft, if it's an allegory for a woman's power, you can see how this fits. She's trying to give up her power, her internal and natural power, to fit into a societal role, a gender role that had been expected up until that point. So here she is trying to do it, but she can't. She can't relinquish her heritage. She can't relinquish her internal power. And every time, it's the thing that saves the day. So it's a really interesting take, and the producers acknowledge that. The show also stood on the line, making commentary on interracial or interreligious marriages between cultures, people getting married, and the negotiations that had to happen. And you see that coming through as well, all masked in this perfectly packaged comedy. So it's a brilliant show. There are some feminist critics that say her trying to be the perfect housewife a la 1950s was not, makes it not a great show and harmful to the movement, while others see it the other way. I tend to see it the other way. I think it was a great step forward for witchcraft and the representation of witchcraft, as well as for women.
Yeah, and it always struck me as it wasn't really necessarily something I appreciated when I was watching it as a little kid, but as a little kid, I was like, oh, Samantha, yeah, saving the day, and it's Darren that's trying to be a loving husband, but is ultimately an oaf, and he's surrounded by these very mortal human oafs as well, like Larry Tate, you know. Meanwhile, she was the boss, you know, so she saved the day. And I love that. And later I realized, like, well, we're also dealing with sort of a variety of other witches. We're getting sort of a diversity of witches in that show as well. Did that make it notable as a pop culture entry as well?
Actually, it didn't, because you have the same thing happening in I Married a Witch, which was 1942, and then Bell Book and Candle, 1957, I believe. And you have, and actually, people think that that Bewitched is actually a copy of those. It's totally a TV version of those. And they said it influenced them, but it's not. It's its own thing. And neither were the other two. They're all independent of each other, but they all give that sense of the witch a family with different types of witches involved. But if you, getting back to your first question about the show, is if you look at the earlier two movies, the witch who's trying to either give up her witchcraft or to get away from something or do whatever the case may be, in Bell Book and Candle, for example, they have to give up their witchcraft to become powerful. They are, or to become, I'm sorry, to get married, to play the role that Samantha has, they have to completely give up their witchcraft and their power. And they do, both of them do. The films end with them both giving up their power, being able to cry, sitting in their chair, knitting, etc. Samantha's the evolution of that. Here she is in part two, let's say. The Witch Next Door part two, or Witch Wife part two, whatever you want to say. And here she is, not, she's married and she's playing that role, but she didn't have to give up her witchcraft. She's trying, but she can't. So it's a great evolution. Right.
Was it unique as far as having, because if we have Endora, we have Paul Lynde's uncle, what was his name?
Uncle Albert. Yeah. Uncle Albert, yeah.
And then Samantha, and then evil Samantha. Was it notable as far as having these different types of witch characters within the same show? Because Samantha is very different from Endora, who is very different from the mischievous, Uncle Albert. So we're getting a variety of witches within the same property.
Right. Yeah. And again, it wasn't unique. They actually lifted that from the other shows, because you have the Aunt Queenie in Bell Book and Candle, who's very much like Endora. She's fantastic. Endora is fantastic. Similar type of what I call clown witches, and they are evolutions of each other. They are part of that. And then you have Uncle Albert and Jack Lemmon's character, her brother's name, in Bell Book and Candle. Very similar characters, same type of roles, same type of masking on theme and character purpose. So it is very much lifted from that same property, as you said. And it gives a sense that there's this witchcraft world in and amongst humanity. And yet it's not evil yet. That comes later. This is sort of it gives the witch a family. It softens her a bit.
And we have, I've spent a lot of time in Salem, and we have, as you mentioned, Salem was early on very much represented in American pop culture with regards to witches, but Bewitched goes to Salem a lot. And in fact, I think it's the Hawthorne Hotel that touts them filming there. And of course, there's the statue of Samantha in Salem. This was before Salem had embraced its reputation as a witch city. Is that correct?
That's what I've been told by historians. I'm not a historian of Salem specifically, but I had to do a lot of research and talk to a lot of good folks, and that is what they said. It wasn't really until the 70s that late 60s maybe, that Salem started to embrace itself as the witch city. Today, if you go there, that's in their logo, the witch city. I think there's a flying witch maybe in the police uniform or something. It's super fun. And the Samantha statue is right there. I've been to the Hawthorne too. They have pictures of Samantha and them being there, and you can actually, there's episodes you can see that in where they do go to Salem. But yes, they do respond. I had some reader comment or some viewer comments from the early days where they got very upset if witchcraft in Salem or in New England was represented poorly, but they didn't fully embrace themselves as America's witch city until I think it was the 70s. Yeah.
Yeah. Now they kind of exist in this amalgam spot of it's a historical location, and yet of horrible murders and executions, and yet also playful pop culture witch city. It kind of occupies both spots.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is the story originally was being told over and over again, or sort of a Salem-like story was being told over and over again, but then Salem emerged as its almost with its own energy. Now today, if something starts in Salem or a small town New England, we know it's going to be a witch film. So it's taken on its own place in our pop culture and in our society in general, in meaning wise. And so, yeah, it does. There's modern witches practicing there that gravitate to there. There's pop culture. The Satanic Temple is there now. Plus, it's got all the history, and it's really doing a good job, from what I understand, to really dig up and honor the people and the history that it has.
I just want to bring up a message from the comments here from the Ghost Maidens. It's a city of witch to kitsch. I like that. Talk a little bit about what happens in the 60s, because it seems like there is this radical shift, and then it just keeps getting even more significant with the following decades. What really happens with the 60s with importance to both Hollywood witches and real witches?
Yeah, a lot. Most people listening probably know what happened in the 60s and 70s. We had a major cultural revolution. A lot of things were broken down and changed and shifted. Lots of movements, eye-opening movements and progressive movements. And so what that did was, first, in terms of Hollywood, up until the 1968, Hollywood was controlled by a censorship organization, its own, that it created, a production code. Every film went through it. And so we had a lot of censorship prior to that. In 1968, Hollywood abandoned that. It realized it was old, and they weren't selling tickets, and they needed to stop. So they ended it in 1968. That changed everything. What I like to say in terms of witchcraft films at that point, all hell broke loose, because that's literally what happened. Prior to 1968, there were very few witchcraft horror films, very, very few. And any that you can find happened in the 60s and probably were mostly indies. Very limited, low budget films. Roger Corman had a couple, The Naked Witch. There's a couple others. So there was very limited. And that's not what we think about when we think about witchcraft films. We think horror in many cases today. So it's very unusual. So that's what happened as far as witchcraft films. All of a sudden we had a rash of horror films, starting with, of course, Rosemary's Baby, which today is still one of the best witchcraft films you can watch. In terms of modern witchcraft practitioners, this was also a time where this was becoming more popular. It was stepping out of the darkness, or the broom closet, as we say in modern witchcraft. People were starting to come together to form organizations. You had Circle Sanctuary started in 1975, I believe. Covenant of the Goddess started in 1975. You had a number of books being published, and they're on the shelves. Books by Raymond Buckland. Gerald Gardner's books first came to the U.S. in 1970. You also had the Church of Satan founded, which is a little different, but Anton LaVey was popular in Hollywood at the time in the late 1960s. This is all part of the progressive movements, also mingling with the women's movement, the environmental movement, and all of the other things, civil rights movement, were all coming together. And so it was a perfect place to birth these the new age, and also occult-based religions and earth-based religions. So it was a boom for both. It was a boom for witchcraft films, the first real rush of them, and a boom for the modern witchcraft community, the birth really of it.
Yeah, we have this wave of liberalism and progressive ideas and secularism, people breaking away from some of these traditional religious modes. And that's happening in the 60s. And then we reach this point where there's a conservative wave towards the end of the 70s and then through the 80s. Obviously, this is a bit of a kind of on the nose, but this definitely kind of put a damper on how some of the witches were being represented in pop culture. talk about the rise of conservatism and the relationship to witchcraft on screen, and how that also set the stage for the Satanic Panic.
Yeah, so in the 70s, it was mostly this outrageous, what I call witch exploitation, coining a term that's used in film scholarship. Witch exploitation was just all over the place. It was definitely occult-based, ceremonial-based, and wasn't necessarily the best portrayals of witchcraft. However, it was starting to merge with some realistic portrayals, a little bit here and there. And you also saw some feminism in there, some feminist films coming through in the mid-70s, and other contemplations which we hadn't seen before. Even if they weren't the best representations, it was breaking boundaries in presentation. However, by the late 70s, as you said, you start to see the fundamentalist movement growing, through a number of organizations formed. And of course, by the 1980s, we hit the beginning of the Satanic Panic. And that really doesn't affect Hollywood until the late 80s. 1987, 1988 is when we start to see the first films. And we get the second wave of witch films. And these are very different. In the 70s, we see coven-based films for the most part, whether it's a male-led coven like necromancy or Blood Sabbath, which is run by a woman. Regardless, they're coven-based, society-based, and that had a lot to do with what was going on at the time. Here we see usually a single woman who is what I call a vamp witch, a extremely sexy, half naked, often. Sometimes she's foreign. That's one of the cues used to overly sexualize women. And she's trying to take down men, or in some cases, it's a group of witches that are trying to eat children. Think Hocus Pocus, think witches, the Witching of Ben. Oh, I never remember the end of that film. There's a number of these movies where you have this happening, which parallels what's going on in the conservative movement. It's a backlash against women working, Satanic Panic fears of witches eating children or harming children. This is what's coming out with a new rash of films from late 80s into the 90s to 1996 exactly.
And you note that going back to 68 for a minute, even though it takes a while for pop culture sometimes to catch up, less time now because things can be made and put out, distributed so quickly. But 68, the author of Rosemary's Baby felt like inadvertently he was somewhat complicit in helping to propel the Satanic Panic, planting the seeds and moving that movement forward. Correct? Am I remembering correctly based on your research?
Yeah, he never, what he said was he never meant it to be realistic.
Right.
And that he also said, and so has Polanski, they've said that this movie was never supposed to be taken literally, but everyone took it literally. And I think that was the period of the time, is that you had a time when Satanism through the Church of Satan, witchcraft, the occult, and all types of New Age stuff were so popular that it was very easy. And fear of all this change and what was going on with Vietnam and Nixon and all this politics. People were afraid. And of course, they took this literally, which, they say is one of the things that did launch the Satanic Panic, or was one of the pieces of it eventually. That was 10 years later, of course. But yeah, he said it was never supposed to be literal. The book, both the director and the original writer said that. But too late. It was taken literal.
I mean, honestly, I kind of took it literal as well. That
yeah.
I guess that's just how effective of a story it is. I mean, you're right that we never actually see the baby, and we never actually see Satan. We're seeing just we're seeing arms, hands, legs, right? But never actually Satan. And the Ghost Maidens, again, in the comments mentioned Suspiria. I think that's a great example as well. According to your research, the scope of your research, we're really looking at American films, and Suspiria was Italian, I believe, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and that's the case. I mean, Polanski's a genius, and so that film it stands the test of time, and it's creepy in the way it should be. I guess you can say it not to be taken literal, but yeah, I always took it literal. But again, it was the time. People were seeing witchcraft covens coming out. There was witchcraft books. People were afraid of who was next to them. They were afraid of what society was happening with society. Of course, they took it literal, and I don't think that's a problem. So good.
So continuing on with this idea of the Satanic Panic, you're mentioning witches eating babies, and these are the others. They are outside the fundamentalist norms. Pardon me, but this sounds kind of familiar to the times right now. Certainly, there are groups like QAnon and fundamentalist Christians that are concerned about Satan worshiping cults that are eating babies. So even if we're not necessarily using the word witches, do you find that we are in the throes of a revamped, refurbished Satanic Panic?
Yes and no. I actually wrote an article for Religion Unplugged that covers this perfectly. That gives the history as well as comparing it to today. And so, yes, we see elements of that. We also see elements of the Red Scare, as I point out in the thing, which was 1950s, which is when The Crucible was written, another witch-based narrative, and people afraid of the commies. We're seeing that a lot as well, and then of course, throw in a little witchcraft and you've got the Salem witch trials. So I think we are definitely seeing a moral panic. Is it specifically a satanic panic? I think it's broader than that. I think the fear is broader than that. But yes, there is elements absolutely of the satanic panic. I don't think it'll look the same yet. I think Dungeons and Dragons is probably still on the shelves, and nobody's complaining about Pokemon right now.
So is this current movement enough to influence pop culture, influence a wave of pop culture? Or do you think that the pop culture that comes out will simply be perhaps commenting on those that are panicking?
That's a really good question. I think that this movement has been happening for a number of years, and there's been a witchcraft evolution or a wave of films that started, as I said earlier, around 2013, which I think is in reaction to the movements we've seen over the past 10 years. The Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. We're seeing a real change in the way witchcraft is presented. So I don't think we're going to see what we saw in the 80s with the Witches of Eastwick or Witchcraft or Warlock, where you have this single powerful, terrifying witch trying to destroy babies or men or whatever the case. I think we're in a different time, and I think witchcraft, modern witchcraft, that is real practice, since that period of time has become more accepted. Practices like tarot and astrology have become more mainstream, that I don't think the backlash will be the same, if there's one. And I haven't really seen a backlash yet. What I've seen is more of Hollywood trying to diversify the way it presents witchcraft. I think our fears are different. We're looking for a hero, and it may be the witch in this case.
Yeah, or from what I've been seeing, with whether it's Midsummer or The Witch, or I mentioned to you in an email the film Hellbender, and there's another one coming up called She Will. That's in theaters now. Have you seen it?
I saw She Will. Yes, I saw She Will and Hellbender. We watched both of them. Mm-hmm.
Great. And it seems like now we're having these witches that maybe are not pure good, but they're they are symbols of empowerment, and their magic, their power is being used as a tool to push back on perhaps injustices, intolerance, and also misogyny.
Exactly. And what you started to see in 2013, 14 is this look at witchcraft not as an essential evil or an essential good. The binary's gone. What it becomes is it's a tool, it's a path, it's a journey, and that the person can go either way with it. A person can be a witch and be evil, or a person can be a witch and be good, or a mix of both, as you see in Beautiful Creatures. She's had one of each eye. So now what you're seeing is an extension of that. And in movies like She Will and Hellbender, the use of magic, sometimes you're morally pushed and challenged by, well, I don't agree with what she's doing. That's problematic. Where's she going with that? But at the same time, you understand why she might be doing something against your own ethics. You have a complicated relationship with these characters now. And it's like getting back to Elphaba, getting back to Sabrina the Teenage Witch. No, I'm sorry, not Sabrina. The Adventures of Sabrina, the new one. I'm sorry, the new Sabrina that came out.
The Netflix one.
Yeah, the Netflix one. Sorry. You're starting to see this complex morality with around witchcraft and the practice of magic. Magic isn't necessarily bad. And witches can do things that are maybe not so great, or they might do things that are great. And a lot of witches now that are presented have been harmed in some way. They've been oppressed, like you said. And if magic is, or if witchcraft and magic are an allegory for personal power, that gives you the power. Turning to witchcraft gives you a power that you're not afforded in another experience.
Yeah, I think you touched on this earlier, but I want to rephrase it and ask more explicitly. The movement of, we had the craft, we had Charmed, we had Buffy, Willow from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And how do you think that the younger people, specifically younger women watching these installments of pop culture, how has that impacted now that they are adult women and also creatives and moving through Hollywood? What do you think that ripple effect and evolution was?
Well, the craft was sort of at the point where the Satanic Panic ended, and this is a new representation of witchcraft. We now had good witchcraft. We had a binary. Wicca was good and witchcraft was bad, is what was being told in pop culture at that point. Wicca was the dressing they put on it, essentially. And I say that only in a pop culture format, not necessarily realistic ways. But Wicca became the way that Hollywood was able to move into a space where it could be accepted. It could present these positive representations of witchcraft. So children, girls, really any genders, anyone who was watching those films and inspired by those, whether they became a witch or not, took that forward. Now Wicca, and then eventually witchcraft as well, were not necessarily bad. So when you move forward 10 years, 20 years, and now they're in Hollywood writing scripts, whether they're a witch or not, they grew up with this understanding that was presented in the 90s and then eventually bled into the 2000s in a lot of TV shows, that witchcraft has many faces, and that could then be explored in the 2010s when these, well, I don't know age groups here, but 2010s, when you started writing your own, scripts and shows and movies and such, you had that backstory in your own brain, that narrative. Oh yeah, that's right. There was good stuff in the craft. Actually, we've seen a lot of remakes of those 90s shows recently. Sabrina, The Craft, Legacy, Charmed came back. Am I missing one? There was a bunch of them. Mm-hmm. Hocus Pocus is coming back.
Hocus Pocus is coming back. That's right.
Yeah,
and even though, as you mentioned, it was not a box office success and it was critically panned, it has such a massive following now that all of the, I guess, millennials They, you know, Gen Xers and millennials love that movie so much. It is worth mentioning, and it's come up in the comments, that Harry Potter, and I know Harry Potter exists in sort of a challenging space as far as your scope of research, but can you just discuss where that fits within your studies and the impact of Potterdom, the wizarding world?
Yeah, the Harry Potter effect is what I talk about. In Harry Potter, our Harry Potter films were so British, culturally based, that I didn't give them. I could have given them a full chapter, probably, number of films alone. But what I talk about is the Harry Potter effect. So in that period of time when Harry Potter films were out, the 2000s. Witchcraft films really were sort of declining in popularity, but yet you had Harry Potter. So what was that? Harry Potter, I would argue, is not a traditional witchcraft film. It's a boy's coming of age story. It's a hero story, similar to what you might see with Star Wars, with a witchcraft overlay, which is really makes it very fun. However, it fell into the 2000s, the popularity of the fantasy films of the 2000s, the epic fantasy films. You had other ones like Lord of the Rings trilogy came out then, and so did Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So you had all this fantasy base. So it was really fell into that, and a lot of this was geared at teens. So what was the effect? Of course, you know, Hollywood likes to copy itself. So you wind up with other movies and TV shows that sort of replicate the idea of the witching world and witchcraft families, and exploring that, like Twitches, and the Wizarding World, the Disney TV show that was on the
Waverly Place.
Waverly, yes, the Witches of Waverly Place. Is that what it is, or the Wizards of Waverly Place? So you have sort of the Harry Potter effect of teen witches, light fare, fantasy based witching worlds, and that sort of came from the Harry Potter popularity. But for the most part, Harry Potter was a hero story, a classic hero story.
I'm going to bring up this question that witchcraft seems to be turning into an aesthetic more than a practice. Well, I'll pose it as a question. Is witchcraft seem to be turning into more of an aesthetic than a practice? And I guess with that, I was personally curious about sort of how you view the relationship between, I'll say, sort of the hot topic witchy memes that emerged about 25 years ago, and then now the coffee cups and the resting witch face and pop culture witchcraft. As how does that fit within sort of the scheme of your take? Is it more of an aesthetic than a practice?
Absolutely not. I think what we're responding to now is that it's become more popular. There is a growing number of people who actually practice, and that the pagan and the witchcraft community is growing, and they're sincere. And in fact, one of my beats for journalism is witchcraft, is witchcraft in the witchcraft world. That exists very strongly, and like I said, it is growing. With that said, we see a growth in the interest in witchcraft and the aesthetic that is also growing. So if you're not involved in the witchcraft community, all you see is the aesthetic, you might say, well, it's probably more aesthetic than it is practice. That's absolutely not the case. But of course, to the average person walking down the street who isn't involved in the witchcraft community, who doesn't know people in the Wiccan world or in any of those adjacent worlds, all you're going to see is the aesthetic, the cups and the hats. It's kind of like October all year round, you know, and you know, some witches, to be honest, talking to the community, some witches have a problem with that. They don't like their sincere religious and spiritual practice being taken over by, or commodified is the right term. However, then there are witches like myself who really don't care. You know, as long as people are practicing sincerely as well, you know, a mug that says resting witch face isn't really, you know, it's great. It's out there. It's fun, you know, so you have that sort of dichotomy, and in really seeing this aesthetic, some people practicing as just an aesthetic that happened in the 90s too, with the craft, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Charmed. I mean, that was the same thing. It's going to happen. It happens with all subcultures. It's not necessarily a huge deal, in my opinion, anyway. And it's a sign that witchcraft has become more mainstream and more accepted, to a degree. If witchcraft can exist in the center or can be accepted, it's getting more accepted.
It is, you know, the
tolerated,
the memes, the coffee cups and everything. I certainly see the reasoning that when you are seriously practicing this as a spiritual belief system, how you could maybe view that as offensive. On the flip side, does that not also add to the tolerance and the acceptance when it's being done in a fun way and not in a way of persecuting those witches? It's lowercase witchcraft. It's the easily accessible, pop culture version of witchcraft.
Right, and that has always existed, and that's the reality of it. That you can't. It's a double face. Exactly what you're saying. It's going to be one. It's going to be part and parcel. And really, when witchcraft started in Hollywood, nobody believed witchcraft existed. And that's one of the things I point out in my book. Is it's important to understand that when the Hollywood producers actually say this in some of their documents, witchcraft did not exist. It was all kitsch back then. So our culture has shown this as kitsch. It wasn't until the 60s and 70s where we started to see it emerge as a spiritual and religious. So our society is not going to just throw away that Halloween fun. And then as witchcraft gets more popular, as tarot and occult gets more popular, people want to take that on as an aesthetic as well. They want to try it on. And sometimes that leads to sincere practice.
And I apologize. Sorry, I lost you for a moment. We timed out for a second. But the moving forward, I guess, and just you mentioned this in a Twitter post, in a tweet, also known as Twitter post. I don't know what that phrasing is. You mentioned this in a tweet, and I think this was more specific to the Satanic Panic, but the Stranger Things versus Midnight Mass, where a lot of people are gravitating to Stranger Things right now as an example, a prime example of commenting on the Satanic Panic, but you tend to take a different spin on that.
Yeah, and I love Stranger Things. Big fan. And they do capture the aesthetic and the narrative, the Satanic Panic, perfectly. I mean, there's elements of it, but they're doing a lot in that show. So they don't really dive into it, the psychological aspects of the Satanic, which there were deep psychological aspects that Stranger Things just can't explore in what they're doing, which is fine. That's no criticism to Stranger Things. The fact that they captured it, and especially in the last couple episodes, or maybe it's the third one or fourth one, was perfect. But at the same time, they're presenting that hell versus heaven, or good versus bad binary, is what I said in my tweet. That doesn't really. That misses the point, that actually feeds a Satanic Panic. And that's not the intention of Stranger Things. That's just the story and that narrative. But Midnight Mass gets into the psychology of moral panic. And that's why, if you really want to understand, and especially it's so pertinent today, it starts slow, but as it builds over its, 6 or 9 shows, I think. It
9 very long episodes.
9 very long episodes. It's slow in the beginning, but it pays off. Stick with it. I promise you will feel satisfied by the end. It really dives in, especially the last 3 or 4 episodes, into the as I said, the psychology, the mass psychology of a moral panic. What leads people to follow somebody, even if it's against their ethics, their morality, to follow somebody down a path that might be problematic, that might lead you to harm a loved one, for example. What leads people to do that? And then in the end, well, I won't give it away.
Yeah, Midnight Mass is excellent. And yeah. I mean, both Stranger Things and Midnight Mass are
absolutely
this season of Stranger Things and Midnight Mass, excellent in very different ways. But as someone that was raised Catholic, I especially related to Midnight Mass and was also terrified by it. But finally, before I let you go, just any predictions about, what else we might be seeing down the road with, you mentioned this earlier, but witchcraft and witches and pop culture, and what do you think the next chapter is going to be when you have to release another volume of this?
Well, I always like to say that my crystal ball's at the shop, so I'm not exactly sure, but I would like to see it parallel what I'm seeing in the witchcraft practice and the popularity of different witchcraft movements. And I'm seeing a lot more interest in folk magics right now, rather than specifically Wicca, although Wicca is still popular. So I think we're going to see, and I would like to see, a more of a representation of magical practices that are not specifically aligned with what we've seen before, that are a little bit more aligned with various diversity, like we saw in the new Witches 2020, where we saw the woman was a hoodoo practitioner and very positively shared and represented. We see all kinds of folk magic practices. And I just worked on a book that shows the depth and beauty of the different types of magical practices that we have here. So I would like to see more of that. So I'm hoping the next chapter is talking about that in some respect. I don't know, though. It's hard to say, because the witch, as I say all the time, is, yeah, she is popular now. The aesthetic is popular, but she always exists in the liminal. She always is pushing boundaries, so she's always on the edge. And like I say at the end of my book, perhaps she's actually ahead of our time. So, she's always going to be there pushing boundaries of our society. So it really depends where we land, where she winds up landing.
All right. And finally, how can people support you? How can they follow you on social media, and perhaps even pick up some witchy merch?
Well, let's see. I am on heathergreene.net. That's my website. You can find me and all of my different links there. heathergreene.net. It's a little under construction, but stick with me. I'm updating it. I hear usability is important, right? And I'm on Twitter, MiraSelena01. You can support me by buying my book and reading. And if you do buy my book, there are lists at the end of each chapter that have the films I used in that chapter. Really, really important. Make sure you watch the movies as you read. This is not a textbook you have to read cover to cover. Watch the movies and let me know on Twitter. I'd love to hear from people. What movies are you watching? What movie wasn't in the book that I should have reviewed and I need to review? I'd love to talk to you about it. And then if you want witchy merch, I do support, it's not my Etsy site, but it is a loved one's Etsy site. Bewitched, thebewitchedhome.com is the website linked to the Etsy site, where you can get some fun witchy merch for your witchcraft practice or for Halloween, which is coming up in a couple months.
And just because it was a final comment sliding in, that even if it's not American, you probably still want to hear about great movies, even though the focus of your book was about American pop culture.
Absolutely. In fact, I have it on You Won't, what is it? You Won't Be Alone, which is not American. I'm all about watching that one soon. So I'd love to hear anyone who's seen that one. And yes, any witch movie, any movie, big fan. Tell me what you watching.
Right. And the book is Lights, Camera, Witchcraft by my guest, Heather Greene. It's a great book. It's so detailed, and I am already craving another edition of it. And Heather, thank you so very much for your time, being so gracious with your time. It was just a fascinating conversation, and I thank you for it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I love talking about witches anytime, and I'll work on that second edition.
Right. Well, hang out backstage for me for a second, and I'll be right back with you. And guys, yeah, Heather Greene, seriously, I love nerding out with someone that has just delved into research in this way. And I can't recommend this book enough. I really enjoyed it. It really is a perfect paranormal pop culture research tome. So you want to get it and keep it around and use it as also a film reference guide. Now, before I leave you, we're doing something new. We want to hear from you. So we want to get your strange stories, family folklore, legends, paranormal stories, all of it, all of it. You can write up these stories, or you can record them and send us audio, and we might read them or play them in a future episode of Talking Strange. So just email talkingstrange@denofgeek.com. Aside from that, thank you for joining. Don't forget to subscribe and download each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, quite honestly. And check out the Talking Strange videos at youtube.com/denofgeekus. And I'd love to hear from you personally at Aaron Sagers on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and Patreon, and at Talk Strange Pod on Twitter. Until next time, my spooky friends, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.